The airport was filled with the usual rush of people moving in every direction. Luggage rolled over shiny tiles, announcements echoed overhead, and families hugged each other before parting ways. Among the crowd walked a young black woman dressed in her military uniform. Her boots clicked steadily against the floor, and her name tag stitched neatly across her chest caught the glow of the fluorescent lights. She had just returned from a long deployment overseas, and this flight was not just a trip home, it was her bridge back into a life she had missed dearly. Her name was Sergeant Maya Johnson. She had spent the last year on duty, standing guard in deserts far away from home, where every sunrise was uncertain and every night was filled with the weight of responsibility. She had missed birthdays, holidays, and simple dinners with her family. Now, as she approached her gate, ticket in hand, she felt a quiet relief. For once, she was not boarding a military transport with noise, dust, and fear. This time she was simply another passenger, a traveler among many. When her group was called, Maya walked confidently onto the plane. Her ticket clearly marked first class, a seat she had chosen and paid for not because she wanted luxury, but because she needed rest. After months of broken sleep on thin mats and long shifts under the scorching sun, she wanted one peaceful journey. She walked down the jet bridge, her back straight, the pride of service reflected in her calm stride. Inside the cabin, the polished seats of first class gleamed. Passengers were already settling in, tucking away bags, adjusting seat belts, and preparing for the long flight ahead. Maya found her seat, carefully stowed her bag in the overhead compartment, and lowered herself into the soft leather cushion. The comfort was a world away from what she was used to, and for a moment she closed her eyes, letting the silence wash over her. But peace did not last. A shadow loomed over her, and when she opened her eyes, she saw a flight attendant standing by her seat. He was tall, his uniform crisp, his smile thin and forced. He looked at her, then at her uniform, then back at her ticket. His voice, though polite on the surface, carried a sharpness that could not be hidden. "Excuse me, miss," he said firmly. "I think you're in the wrong seat. This section is for first class." Maya blinked, confused. She glanced at the ticket in her hand, then back at him. "This is my seat," she replied calmly. Her voice was soft but steady, the kind of voice trained to remain firm under pressure. The attendant frowned, tilting his head as though he had not heard her correctly. "No, I think you must be mistaken. Economy is further back." A couple of passengers sitting nearby looked up, their curiosity piqued. Some frowned, others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Maya could feel their eyes on her, but she kept her posture straight. Slowly she handed him her ticket. "It says 2A, that's this seat." The attendant looked at the ticket, and for a moment his jaw tightened. There was no mistake. But instead of apologizing, his voice dropped lower. "Yes, but this seat is reserved for certain passengers. You may need to move." The words hung in the air. Around her, passengers exchanged glances. Some looked away quickly, pretending not to hear, while others leaned closer to catch every word. Maya felt a sting, not because of the seat, but because of what was behind those words. She had heard this tone before, in different ways and different places. A tone that said she did not belong, but she had faced storms far harsher than this. She had stood under skies filled with sand and fire, had carried her fellow soldiers to safety, had kept guard when everyone else slept. Compared to that, this was just another test. "I bought this ticket," Maya said firmly, her eyes locked on the attendants. "I have every right to sit here." The man straightened, clearly unsettled by her confidence. "Ma'am, I'm asking you politely. This is not your section." The tension in the cabin thickened. A few passengers exchanged whispers. A man in a business suit a row behind leaned forward to watch. A woman across the aisle frowned in disapproval, but she said nothing. Everyone was waiting to see what would happen next. Maya could feel the weight of their silence pressing down on her shoulders. But instead of shrinking back, she lifted her chin higher. She thought of her father's words, spoken years ago before she left for her first deployment. "Never let anyone make you forget who you are. Stand tall because you carry more than just your name, you carry the sacrifices of those who came before you." She placed her hands on her knees and spoke clearly, so not just the attendant but everyone around could hear. "I wore this uniform for a reason. I serve this country so that every person on this plane has the right to live free and safe. That includes me. And this seat is mine, fair and square." A ripple of quiet moved through the cabin. The passengers shifted, some now looking at her with respect, others with surprise. The attendant hesitated, He had not expected resistance, not in front of everyone. He was used to people nodding, apologizing, moving along quietly. But Maya was not like most people. Her heart was beating fast, but her face remained calm. She knew this was no longer about a seat. This was about dignity. The silence was broken when a passenger cleared his throat. The businessman behind her spoke up. "She's right. That's her ticket. She deserves to sit there." His voice was deep, carrying authority. The woman across the aisle nodded slowly, murmuring in agreement. The attendant looked around, suddenly aware that the cabin was no longer on his side. His jaw tightened, and though he still stood tall, the certainty in his eyes had faltered. Maya leaned back in her seat, her gaze never wavering. She did not shout. She did not argue beyond what was needed. Her calm defiance was more powerful than any raised voice could have been. She knew who she was, and no one could take that from her. The passengers continued to watch, waiting for the attendant's next move. And in that heavy pause, something shifted. It was as though the cabin itself recognized that this moment mattered. Maya folded her hands in her lap and whispered inwardly a quiet reminder to herself. Respect is not something you beg for. Respect is something you carry, and others either see it or they don't. But it is always yours. The flight attendant, realizing he could push no further, forced a stiff smile and muttered, "Very well. Please remain seated." He stepped back, moving down the aisle, but his pride was bruised. Maya closed her eyes again, but this time not to rest. She was thinking of all the people who had faced moments like this. Moments where someone questioned their worth. Moments where silence pressed in on them. She hoped her calm stand would remind someone somewhere that dignity is not negotiable. The plane had not even taken off, but the journey had already begun. Not just her journey home, but a journey that would leave an impression on every person sitting in that cabin. They had witnessed a quiet act of courage, and though no applause was given, respect had started to bloom in the silence. The air inside the cabin felt heavier after the first exchange. Though the flight attendant had walked away, the atmosphere remained tense. Passengers shifted in their seats, stealing glances at Maya, and then quickly looking away when her eyes met theirs. It was as though the whole plane had been pulled into a silent debate, with every person wondering what to say, what to think, and what to do. Maya sat still, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her chin slightly lifted. To anyone watching closely, she looked calm, even unbothered. But inside, her heart thudded against her ribs. She was no stranger to pressure. She had faced worse. Much worse. But there was something deeply painful about being questioned in this way in her own country, while wearing the very uniform that symbolized service and sacrifice. She remembered long nights on deployment, staring up at the sky filled with endless stars, feeling small but determined. Back then, she had promised herself she would carry dignity no matter the circumstance. Yet now, as whispers circled around her, she wondered if anyone else on this plane understood the weight of what had just happened. Across the aisle, a young man in a navy sweater leaned toward his companion. "Maybe she really doesn't belong here," he murmured under his breath. The words were not loud, but in the hushed cabin they traveled farther than he intended. Maya caught them, and though she did not flinch, a part of her heart tightened. From another row, a woman whispered to her husband, "She's a soldier. Look at her uniform. If anyone deserves first class, it's her." Her tone was filled with quiet admiration. Her husband nodded, though his expression showed uncertainty, as though he was torn between speaking up or staying silent. The cabin had become a mirror of society itself, some people doubting, others defending, most simply watching. Every whisper carried judgment. Every glance held weight. Maya's eyes drifted toward the window. Clouds rolled lazily outside, and the vast sky seemed to echo her thoughts. She had fought battles that most people in this plane would never know existed. She had walked through dust storms that blinded vision, heard the crack of gunfire in the dead of night, and sat with comrades as they wept over letters from home. She had done it all quietly, without expecting recognition. And now to be told she was not allowed to sit where she rightfully belonged, it was a wound sharper than any blade. Still, she held her posture. She would not let frustration show. Her silence was not weakness. It was discipline. The murmurs continued. A man in the back scoffed, shaking his head as if the entire situation was unnecessary. A middle-aged woman with kind eyes kept looking at Maya as though silently encouraging her. The divide in the cabin was clear, though no one openly argued. Minutes felt longer than hours. The tension had not faded when the attendant returned, this time with a sterner expression. His jaw was set, his posture rigid, and though he tried to mask his irritation, it showed in the way he held his shoulders. "Ma'am," he said firmly, his voice carrying more authority than before, "I will need to see your ticket again." Maya handed it over without hesitation. Her movements were deliberate, her eyes locked on his. There was no trace of apology in her face. The attendant scanned the ticket slowly, perhaps hoping to find a mistake, some small detail that would justify his earlier words. But the truth was printed clearly. First class, seat 2A. There was no doubt, no loophole, no error. It was hers, yet instead of offering an apology, he cleared his throat and spoke again. "This section is usually reserved for premium passengers. It is," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "unusual to see this situation." His words, though cloaked in politeness, carried a sting. Maya understood what he meant. So did everyone else listening. The whispers grew louder. This time, a voice from a few rows back rose above the rest. "What's unusual?" "She bought her ticket. Let her sit." The speaker was an older man, his hair silver, his voice filled with steady conviction. He leaned forward, looking directly at the attendant. "She's earned her place." The attendant's expression faltered. He looked around, realizing he no longer had the quiet support of the crowd. More passengers were nodding, some murmuring in agreement. The tide was beginning to shift, but Maya did not rely on their voices. She lifted her chin and spoke again, her tone clear and unwavering. "I have served this country with everything I have. I did not ask for favors, and I do not need anyone to hand me respect. I paid for this seat, and I will sit here because I deserve to. Not because of my uniform, but because I am a person with the same rights as anyone else." Her words landed heavy in the silence that followed. The weight of truth filled the cabin like a storm that had finally broken. For the first time, some passengers looked ashamed for their earlier whispers. The young man in the navy sweater lowered his eyes, unable to meet her gaze. It was then that something remarkable happened. One by one, passengers began to shift their loyalty. A businessman loosened his tie and muttered, "She's right." The woman across the aisle spoke up more boldly. "You should be thanking her, not questioning her." Even a child near the back asked her mother in a clear voice, "Why can't she sit there if it's her seat?" Children had a way of cutting through complexity with simple honesty, and the mother's answer, hesitant and embarrassed, never came. The attendant, now visibly flustered, straightened his uniform and handed the ticket back to Maya. His lips parted as though to say something more, but no words came. He turned abruptly and walked away, his authority shaken. Maya exhaled slowly, though not in triumph. This was not a victory she had sought. She did not want confrontation. All she had wanted was peace, a quiet flight home. But life had placed her in a moment where silence would have been surrender, and she had chosen instead to stand not with anger, but with dignity. The passengers who had once doubted her now looked at her differently. Some offered small nods of respect. Others avoided her gaze out of guilt. The atmosphere, though still heavy, had shifted. She had not just defended her seat. She had forced everyone to look at themselves and ask what they truly believed about fairness and respect. Maya leaned back, her eyes drifting once more to the window. Outside, the sky stretched endlessly, unbothered by human conflict. She thought of the many battles she had faced, the sacrifices she had carried, and the promises she had kept to those who depended on her. This was just another chapter, another test, and she had endured it as she always did, with grace. The whispers had stopped now. The murmurs of doubt had been silenced, not by force but by truth. And as the plane prepared for takeoff, Maya felt something shift within herself too. She had come seeking rest, but she realized her presence had served a greater purpose. Without meaning to, she had reminded everyone on that flight that dignity cannot be denied when it is carried with conviction. The engines roared to life. The plane began to move, and though the journey had only just begun, everyone in that cabin knew they had already witnessed something unforgettable. The plane rose steadily into the sky, its engines humming like a deep lullaby that filled the cabin. Outside the windows, the clouds looked soft and endless, like mountains of white stretching across the horizon. For most passengers, it was the usual scene of a flight beginning. But inside the cabin, the air carried the quiet after a storm. People were still replaying what they had just witnessed, Some were proud of how Maya had spoken. Others were uneasy, realizing how quick they had been to doubt her. Maya sat still, her hands folded, her eyes calm but alert. She was not thinking about the comfort of the seat anymore. She was thinking about how easily dignity could be questioned, how quickly people could look at someone and decide whether they belonged. She wondered how many others had faced moments like this, moments when the world seemed to test their worth with silent judgment. The silence was broken when a man from across the aisle leaned toward her. He looked nervous, as if choosing each word carefully. "Excuse me," he said quietly. I just want to say thank you for your service. I didn't speak up earlier, and maybe I should have, but I want you to know I respect what you did." Maya turned her head slowly, meeting his eyes. There was sincerity in his voice, the kind that could not be faked. She gave a small nod. "Thank you," she replied softly. Her voice carried no bitterness. She did not need an apology. His recognition was enough. From a few rows back, the older man with silver hair spoke again, louder this time so others could hear. She should not have had to explain herself at all. A ticket is a ticket. Respect should not depend on whether someone wears a uniform, or their skin color, or anything else. It should be automatic. His words rippled through the cabin. Heads turned. Some passengers shifted uncomfortably. Others nodded in agreement. The young man in the navy sweater, who had whispered doubts earlier, now looked down at his lap. His face was flushed, and he avoided Maya's gaze. Maya listened, but she did not gloat. She knew change never came from embarrassment alone. It came from reflection, from people truly seeing the truth for themselves. She looked at the older man and offered a small, grateful smile. The flight attendant had not returned since handing her ticket back, but Maya knew he was nearby, probably avoiding her gaze as he moved through the cabin. She wondered what he was thinking now. Did he feel shame? Or did he simply feel annoyed that his authority had been challenged? She could not know. But she hoped he had learned something, that respect cannot be measured by appearance or assumption. As the plane leveled out at cruising altitude, drinks and snacks were served. The atmosphere softened a little, though the earlier tension lingered like an echo. People spoke in lower voices, careful not to spark another conflict. Yet in their silence, something had shifted. It was as though the cabin had become a classroom, and Maya, without meaning to, had become the teacher. She leaned back in her seat, her thoughts drifting to her time in service. She remembered nights when she stood watch, her eyes scanning the horizon for danger while her comrades slept. She remembered the sound of footsteps crunching on gravel, the radio crackling with urgent voices, the cold meals eaten in haste. She remembered carrying her gear until her shoulders ached, pushing through exhaustion because others depended on her. Those memories were heavy, but they were also a source of strength. They reminded her who she was and why she could not allow anyone to take away her dignity. She was more than just a passenger. She was more than just a soldier. She was a human being who had given her best for others, and that truth would always speak louder than doubt. Suddenly, a voice cut through her thoughts. It came from a young girl sitting a few rows ahead, her tone innocent and curious. "Mom?" the child asked. "Why did that man say she couldn't sit there?" The question was pure, without malice, but it made the cabin fall quiet again. The mother hesitated, clearly unsure of what to say. Finally, she whispered something too soft for others to hear. But the child's question had already done its work. It reminded everyone on that plane that children see clearly what adults often complicate. Maya smiled faintly. Children had a way of exposing truth with a single sentence. The older man with silver hair leaned back in his seat, looking around at the passengers. "Maybe it's time we all ask ourselves that same question," he said quietly but loud enough to be heard. His voice carried a weight that made people pause. No one argued. No one challenged his words. The silence that followed was not the silence of doubt. It was the silence of reflection. Maya took a sip of water from the glass the attendant had left earlier. She thought of the girl's question again. Why had he said she could not sit there? The answer was simple yet painful. Some people still carried assumptions, still measured worth by appearances, still failed to see the humanity in front of them. But she also knew the truth. Dignity cannot be erased by doubt. It lives within, unshaken, waiting for moments like this to shine. The engines hummed steadily as the plane cut through the sky. Passengers returned slowly to their books, their screens, their conversations. But the memory of what had happened lingered. Some would carry it with them long after the flight, telling others about the soldier who stood her ground with calm strength. Maya closed her eyes, not in sleep, but in reflection. She thought of her family waiting at home, the hugs she would receive, the meals she had missed. She thought of her fellow soldiers still out there, serving in silence, facing battles both seen and unseen. She thought of how many of them had faced similar moments, moments where respect had to be defended, where dignity had to be claimed. She whispered a silent promise to herself, to always carry her strength with grace, to remind others that true power does not come from anger, but from truth spoken calmly. As the plane flew on, the murmurs of doubt that had once filled the cabin faded completely. In their place was something else, quiet admiration, unspoken respect, and the subtle shift of hearts that had been touched by her courage. Maya did not need applause. She did not need recognition. All she needed was the knowledge that she had stayed true to herself. And that was enough. The journey was far from over, but she knew one thing for certain. The fight for dignity was not won in loud battles. It was won in quiet moments like this, when someone chose to stand even while sitting, and remind the world of a simple truth: respect belongs to everyone. The plane had been in the air for over an hour when the quiet began to feel almost fragile, as though one wrong word could shatter it. Most passengers kept to themselves, staring at screens, sipping coffee, or flipping through magazines, but their thoughts still circled around the moment earlier, the soldier who had been told she did not belong, and the calm power of her reply. No one could quite let it go. Maya sat still, her gaze fixed on the window, watching the world below shrink into shades of white and blue. From this height, every mountain and river seemed small, almost unimportant. Yet inside the cabin, the weight of what had happened loomed large. She could still feel the stares, even when they pretended not to look. The attendant had returned a few times to serve drinks and snacks, but he avoided meeting her eyes. His voice was softer now, his movements stiff with caution. Maya noticed, but she did not gloat. She knew that humiliation was not the same as change. What mattered was not his discomfort, but whether he would think differently the next time he faced a moment like this. Her thoughts drifted again to the people she had served with overseas. She remembered a night when the camp had been attacked and everyone scrambled to defend their post. She remembered the exhaustion afterward, sitting in the dust with her helmet in her lap, sweat dripping down her face, and one of her comrades whispering, "Will anyone even know what we do here?" That question had stayed with her, and now sitting in first class thousands of miles away, she realized the answer. Most people never knew the weight soldiers carried, and if they did know, many forgot quickly. She took a slow breath. She was not angry. She was simply tired of moments like this, moments where dignity had to be explained. Across the aisle, the little girl who had asked the question earlier leaned out of her seat again. Her big eyes sparkled with innocence. "Are you really a soldier?" she asked, her voice sweet and curious. Maya smiled faintly and nodded. "Yes, I am." The girl's eyes widened. "Do you fight bad guys?" Some passengers chuckled softly at the child's simple honesty, but Maya answered with the same calm dignity she always carried. "Sometimes, but most of the time I protect people. I help them stay safe." The girl thought about that, then nodded as if it all made perfect sense. "Then you should sit here. Heroes sit in the front." The cabin filled with a ripple of warmth at the child's words. They were so simple yet so piercing. No one could argue with her innocence. Maya smiled, touched more deeply than she expected. Children saw truth without the layers of judgment adults often carried. The girl's mother gently pulled her back into her seat, embarrassed. But Maya leaned forward slightly and whispered so the child could still hear. "Thank you. That means a lot to me." From then on, something shifted in the atmosphere. It was as if the little girl had broken the last bit of tension. People started to relax. A man a few rows back leaned over and said, "Thank you for serving." Another nodded quietly, meeting Maya's eyes with respect. Slowly, acknowledgement replaced awkward silence. But not everyone was ready to move on. A younger man sitting closer to the front, dressed in a sharp suit, suddenly spoke up. His tone was casual, but his words carried a sting. "With all due respect, this is first class. It's not about being a hero. It's about what you can pay for. And let's be honest, how often do soldiers even fly like this?" The words cut through the cabin like a knife. Conversation stopped. The little girl frowned, confused by the man's tone. Maya turned her head slowly, her eyes steady on him. She could have ignored him. She could have let the silence bury his words. But she knew the passengers were waiting for her reply, waiting to see how dignity looked when tested again. Her voice was calm, without anger, yet it carried to every seat. You're right. This seat isn't about being a hero. It isn't about wearing a uniform. It's about the fact that I bought this ticket with my own hard-earned money, just like you did. The difference is, while you were at your job, I was overseas in places you'll never see, doing things you'll never have to do, so that we could both be here today, free to sit in any seat we can afford. So no, I don't need anyone to give me this place. I already earned it. Her words landed heavy. The man in the suit leaned back, his confidence shaken. He opened his mouth as if to reply, but quickly shut it again when he realized the cabin was no longer with him. Eyes turned toward Maya. Nods of approval rippled quietly through the seats. The older man with silver hair spoke up again, his voice deep and unwavering. Young man, sometimes respect isn't about money. It's about understanding sacrifice. And from where I sit, this soldier has given more than any of us. You might do well to remember that. The younger man looked away, his face burning red. He did not speak again. Maya's heart beat steadily. She had not raised her voice. She had not tried to humiliate anyone, but she had spoken the truth, and the truth had its own power. She leaned back once more, her hands resting calmly in her lap. She felt no triumph, only a quiet peace. The rest of the flight carried on with less tension. Passengers returned to their routines, but their stolen glances now held respect instead of doubt. Some wanted to speak to her, to thank her, but most simply carried silent admiration. The little girl peeked back every so often, smiling shyly, and Maya smiled in return. Hours passed, the plane moving closer to its destination. The night sky outside was filled with stars, the kind Maya had often stared at while on duty. Only now she could see them from above the clouds. She thought of all the sacrifices, hers, her comrades, and even the families who waited for them back home. She thought of how small a seat seemed compared to all of that, and yet she knew this moment mattered because respect was never about size. It was about principle. When the captain's voice came over the intercom announcing they would begin their descent soon, passengers started to pack up their belongings. But the memory of earlier remained with them. They had not just taken a flight. They had witnessed strength, quiet and steady, that left its mark. As the wheels touched down and the plane rolled along the runway, Maya felt the relief of being closer to home. Yet she also felt something deeper. She had not wanted a scene. She had not asked for it. But it had come, and she had met it with calm truth. That was enough. When the plane came to a stop and people began to stand, the little girl tugged at her mother's sleeve and pointed at Maya. "Can we say bye to her?" she asked. The mother hesitated, but then nodded. They waited as passengers shuffled out. When Maya stood, the child looked up at her with a wide grin. "Bye, soldier." "Thank you." Maya's smile softened. "Goodbye, sweetheart." "Stay brave." The girl beamed, her words innocent yet powerful. "I will." And with that, Maya stepped off the plane. She did not seek applause, nor did she need validation. What she carried with her was greater. A reminder that sometimes the strongest reply is not the loudest, but the one spoken with calm truth that makes people see the world differently. The airport lights shimmered in the distance as passengers slowly stepped off the plane. For most, the flight would be just another memory, soon to be replaced by the rush of luggage claims and taxi rides. But for those who had been seated in that first-class cabin, the images of what had unfolded lingered like a story they would tell for years. A soldier in uniform, questioned, doubted, and yet unshaken. A reply that silenced not only an attendant, but also the doubts of strangers. Maya walked calmly through the jet bridge, her duffel bag slung over her shoulder. She did not rush. Her steps carried the weight of reflection, the quiet knowledge that sometimes a simple moment on a flight could become larger than the journey itself. She had not planned to speak that way. She had not intended to stand as an example. All she had wanted was peace. But life often chose its own lessons, and she had been placed in the center of one. As she entered the terminal, people passed her in waves, dragging luggage, checking phones, greeting loved ones. The world kept moving. But Maya noticed something subtle. Some passengers from her cabin glanced at her again, their eyes softer, more thoughtful. A few even offered small nods, a silent acknowledgement of respect. She returned the gestures with quiet dignity. She did not need words. The older man with silver hair who had spoken up for her during the flight caught up as she walked. His face was lined with years of experience, but his eyes were kind. "Sergeant," he said warmly, "I want you to know what you did back there mattered. People saw it. They'll remember it. You reminded all of us what courage looks like." Maya paused, looking at him with steady eyes. "Thank you. But I wasn't trying to make a scene, I just didn't want to lose my dignity." The man shook his head. "Sometimes the most powerful lessons happen when we don't try to teach them. You stood firm without shouting, without anger. That's rare these days. People notice it more than you think." Maya gave a faint smile. "I hope so." They walked together for a few steps before parting ways. He disappeared into the crowd, leaving Maya with his words echoing in her thoughts. Maybe he was right. Maybe strength did not always look like force. Maybe it was in the calm refusal to be diminished. The quiet way of reminding the world that respect is not optional. At the baggage carousel, she waited patiently, watching suitcases circle endlessly before spotting her own. She lifted it with ease, her muscles trained from years of carrying gear heavier than this. As she turned, she noticed the young man in the navy sweater, the one who had whispered doubts earlier, standing nearby. His face was tense, his eyes darting as though he was unsure whether to approach. Finally, he stepped forward. "Ma'am," he began awkwardly, his voice lower than before. I wanted to say I'm sorry. Back on the plane, I judged too quickly. I shouldn't have said what I did." "You didn't deserve that." Maya studied him for a moment. His shoulders were hunched, his expression genuinely remorseful. She could see he was struggling with guilt. She could have brushed him off, but she chose compassion. "You don't need to apologize to me," she said gently. "What matters is what you do from here. Think about how you see people, how quick we all are to assume. If you change that, then this moment won't be wasted." He nodded, relief in his eyes. "I will, thank you." She gave him a small nod and walked on. It was not about collecting apologies. It was about planting seeds. If even one person carried the lesson forward, then the struggle had meaning. Outside the airport, the cool night air wrapped around her like a quiet embrace. She looked up at the dark sky sprinkled with stars. It reminded her of the nights overseas when she had stared at the same stars from deserts and camps far from home. Back then, she had wondered if anyone truly understood what soldiers endured. Tonight she realized that maybe the answer was not in everyone understanding fully, but in small moments like this where respect was awakened in hearts one at a time. A car pulled up, and her brother stepped out with a grin, waving. "Maya," he called, rushing over to hug her. She melted into the embrace, the familiar warmth reminding her that despite everything, home was still here, waiting for her. As they drove through the city lights, he asked about her flight. She hesitated, then told him the story. His hands tightened on the wheel as he listened, his face hardening with anger at the thought of her being disrespected. But she placed a hand on his arm and said softly, "It's all right. I handled it." And maybe it opened a few eyes. Her brother glanced at her, admiration softening his anger. "You've always been stronger than most, but you shouldn't have to be." She smiled faintly, staring out the window. "None of us should. But until the world changes, I'll keep standing tall." Back in her room later that night, Maya placed her uniform neatly in the closet. She traced the name tag with her fingers, remembering all the times she had worn it in places far less forgiving than an airplane. She thought of the people who had whispered against her, the ones who had defended her, the little girl who had called her a hero. All of it wove together into a single truth. Her reply had not been about claiming a seat. It had been about claiming respect, not just for herself, but for anyone who had ever been told they did not belong. She sat on the edge of her bed, writing in a small notebook she carried everywhere. The words flowed simply. Respect is not a gift. It is a right. And when it is denied, we must remind the world with calm strength. Today was not about a flight. It was about dignity. Closing the notebook, she felt a quiet peace settle over her. The day had been heavy, but it had also been meaningful. She knew the story would live on in the minds of those passengers, and perhaps when they saw another soldier, another person who looked different from themselves, they would remember. She turned off the light and lay down, her body finally relaxing after the long journey. Sleep came slowly, but it came with the comfort of knowing she had stood firm. Not for recognition, but for truth. Somewhere, high above in the night sky, planes continued to cross paths, carrying people with their own struggles, their own lessons. But on that one flight, a powerful reply had been given. A reply that reminded the world that no seat, no section, no label could define a person's worth. Only their humanity could. The days after the flight unfolded quietly, but the memory of what had happened refused to fade. For Maya, it was just one more chapter in her journey as a soldier and as a woman determined never to bow her head when dignity was questioned. For others who had witnessed it, though, the moment grew into something larger. The people who had been seated in that cabin carried the story with them, retelling it to their families, their friends, and even strangers. Each retelling shaped the lesson differently, but the core remained the same. One soldier, one seat, and one powerful reply that made silence impossible. Maya spent the first few days back home catching up with her family. The warmth of her brother's laughter, the smell of her mother's cooking, and the comfort of her old neighborhood all filled her with a peace she had missed during deployment. But even at home, the memory of the flight stayed near her thoughts. She replayed the faces of the passengers, the hushed whispers, the little girl calling her a hero, the man in the suit who had been silenced by truth. All of it reminded her how fragile respect could be, and how important it was to hold on to it firmly. One afternoon, while she was out running errands, Maya stopped by a small coffee shop near the town square. As she stood in line, she noticed a familiar face, the older man with silver hair from the plane. He was seated at a corner table reading a newspaper. His eyes lit up when he saw her, and he quickly stood to greet her. "Sergeant Johnson," he said warmly, extending his hand. "I wondered if I'd ever cross paths with you again." Maya smiled, shaking his hand firmly. "I didn't expect to see you here either. Small world." He motioned for her to join him, and after ordering a drink, she sat down across from him. His newspaper lay open to an article, and to her surprise, it was about a recent debate on how veterans were treated in civilian life. The headline read, "Respect Beyond Uniform, The Struggle of Soldiers at Home." The man noticed her glance and tapped the page. "After that flight, I couldn't stop thinking. It made me realize how often people overlook those who serve. I've shared what happened with my colleagues, my friends, even my church group. It's amazing how many people have faced their own version of what you went through. Different circumstances, same question of dignity." Maya leaned back, absorbing his words. She hadn't wanted the flight to become a spectacle, but if people were learning from it, maybe it was worth the discomfort. "I didn't want attention," she admitted quietly. "I just wanted fairness. Sometimes it feels like every step is a test." The man nodded slowly. "Fairness always comes with a fight. But your reply, it wasn't angry, it wasn't bitter. It was truth. That's why it stayed with people. Truth spoken calmly can cut deeper than shouting ever could." Their conversation stretched on, weaving through stories of his past as a teacher, her past as a soldier, and their shared hope that future generations would grow up knowing respect as something natural, not something demanded. By the time she left the cafe, Maya felt lighter. She realized that her words had not just defended her seat, they had started ripples she might never fully see. A week later, she received an unexpected phone call. It was from the airline itself. The representative on the line sounded formal, but there was an undertone of unease. They explained that a complaint had been filed by another passenger, one who had written about how poorly the situation had been handled. The story had reached the higher offices, and the airline wanted to extend an apology. Maya listened quietly, letting them finish. The representative offered compensation, free flights, and a public apology. But Maya interrupted gently. "I'm not looking for freebies," she said. "I just want to know that the next time someone boards your plane, wearing a uniform or not, they won't have to defend their dignity. That's worth more than vouchers or words." The line was silent for a moment before the representative replied, "We understand. We'll make changes." When she hung up, Maya sat in stillness, reflecting on how quickly one moment of injustice had turned into a lesson not just for passengers, but for an entire company. She did not know if they would truly change, but she hoped they would. As days turned into weeks, Maya went about her routine. Yet every now and then, strangers stopped her in public. Some were veterans who had heard about the story, thanking her for standing firm. Others were ordinary citizens who simply wanted to say they admired her reply. Each time, Maya accepted the words with grace but reminded herself of something important. It had never been about becoming a symbol. It had been about protecting the quiet truth of her own dignity. One evening, she sat with her brother on the porch, watching the sun set over the horizon. He asked her if she ever regretted speaking up. She thought about it, her eyes tracing the streaks of orange and purple in the sky. "No," she said finally. "Because if I had stayed quiet, I would have lost something more than a seat. I would have lost a part of myself. And once you give that away, it's hard to get it back." Her brother nodded, his face filled with pride. "You didn't just speak for yourself. You spoke for everyone who's ever been told they don't belong." The evening air grew cooler and Maya closed her eyes, letting the wind brush against her face. She realized then that dignity was not just personal, it was collective. Every time one person stood against disrespect, they carried the weight of many who could not. The story of the flight continued to spread quietly, carried from one conversation to another. And though Maya did not seek the spotlight, she could not deny that her reply had become more than her own defense. It had become a reminder to others. Respect is not earned by appearance. It is not granted by permission. It exists because humanity itself deserves it. That night, as she prepared for bed, Maya wrote again in her notebook, "Strength is not in the uniform, but in the soul. The uniform may show service, but the soul shows dignity, and when both stand together, no voice can erase them." She closed the notebook, placed it beside her bed, and turned off the light. Sleep came slowly, but it came with peace. Somewhere in homes far from hers, people who had been on that flight were still thinking about her words. Some were retelling the story. Some were reflecting silently, and maybe, just maybe, they would act differently the next time they faced a moment of choice. For Maya, that was enough. Her journey was not about applause. It was about the quiet victories that live on long after the moment has passed. Months had passed since the flight, but the moment still followed Maya like a shadow that did not weigh her down, but instead reminded her of the path she had chosen. She had returned to her duties as a soldier, balancing training, responsibilities, and the quiet routines of life at home. Yet everywhere she went, she noticed something had shifted, not in her, but in the people who crossed her path. Some recognized her from the story that had spread beyond the cabin walls. Others had only heard whispers of the soldier who refused to surrender her seat, but their eyes carried unspoken admiration when they realized who she was. At first, Maya struggled with the attention. She had not wanted to become a story. She had simply wanted fairness. But as time passed, she began to understand that her reply had given something larger to others. It had given them permission to stand tall in their own lives. One morning, she was invited to speak at a local high school. The principal had called her after hearing from a parent who had been on the flight. At first, Maya resisted. She was not a speaker. She was not a hero on a stage. She was a soldier who had done her job and defended her dignity. But the principal's words stayed with her. Sometimes young people need to hear from someone who's lived courage, not just read about it. So she went. Standing in the school gymnasium before rows of restless students, Maya felt a familiar kind of pressure, the same kind she had felt in the cabin that day. She gripped the microphone and spoke in her steady, calm voice. She told them about her time in service, about the nights under the stars in faraway lands, about the sacrifices and the pride of wearing the uniform. And then she told them about the flight. The room grew still as she described the attendants' words, the whispers, the silence of the passengers, and the moment she had chosen to speak. She did not dramatize it. She did not exaggerate. She told it simply, honestly, and with the same quiet dignity she had carried on the plane. When she finished, the students clapped. Not the loud, careless claps of an audience fulfilling an obligation, but the slow, thoughtful applause of people who had been moved. Afterward, some came up to her, shy but curious. One young girl said, "I get bullied sometimes, but when you said you wouldn't give up your seat, it made me think, maybe I don't have to give up who I am either." Maya placed a hand on the girl's shoulder and said softly, "Never give up who you are. That's the one thing no one can take unless you let them." As she left the school, Maya realized that her story was no longer just hers. It had become a tool, a reminder, a light for others walking through their own struggles. She had not asked for that role, but perhaps life had chosen it for her. Weeks later, she received another call, this time from a veterans organization. They had heard about her experience and wanted her to share it at a gathering. She agreed. Not because she liked the attention, but because she knew the importance of speaking truth where others might still be silent. At the event, surrounded by men and women who carried their own heavy stories, Maya felt at home. She told her story again, and as she looked into their eyes, she saw recognition. They understood what it meant to be doubted, dismissed, or forgotten. And they, too, understood the power of standing firm. After the event, an older woman in uniform approached her. She had served decades earlier, in a time when respect for women in the military had been even harder to come by. Her eyes glistened with tears as she said, "I wish someone like you had been there back then. You remind me that we've come a long way and we must keep going." Maya held her hands tightly. "We carry each other's strength," she replied. As the seasons changed, the story of the flight faded from headlines and conversations, but the lesson remained alive in the people who had heard it. Maya returned to her duties, continued her service, and lived her life with the same steady grace. She never sought to repeat the moment, never tried to make herself into more than she was. She simply continued to walk with dignity, knowing that true strength is not measured by applause or recognition, but by the ability to remain unshaken when others question your worth. One evening, sitting on her porch again as the sun dipped below the horizon, Maya reflected on everything that had happened. She thought about the flight attendant, wondering if he had learned to see people differently. She thought about the man in the suit silenced by truth. She thought about the young girl who had called her a hero, and she thought about all the passengers whose silence had turned to reflection. She realized then that her reply had never really been about a seat in first class. It had been about something far deeper. It had been about reminding people that dignity is not a luxury, not a prize, not a favor given by others. It is a birthright. And when questioned, it must be defended, not with anger, not with violence, but with truth that speaks for itself. Maya picked up her notebook, the same one where she had written after the flight. She turned to a fresh page and began to write. Courage is not always in the battlefield. Sometimes it is in a seat on a plane, in a classroom, in a workplace, in an ordinary moment where someone decides not to move when told they do not belong. That is where dignity lives. That is where it must rise. She closed the notebook and set it down, her heart full of peace. She had lived her truth. She had spoken her truth. And through that, she had become more than a passenger on a flight. She had become a reminder that respect cannot be denied when carried with calm strength. The night sky above stretched endlessly, the stars shining like watchful eyes. And in that vastness, Maya knew that even the smallest stand for dignity could echo farther than she would ever see. She did not need to chase the echoes. It was enough to know they existed. And so her journey continued, not as a story told for applause, but as a life lived with quiet power. Her reply had been powerful that day on the plane, but her true power was the way she continued to live afterward, each step reminding the world of a simple truth. Respect is not a privilege. It is a right.